Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Christopher Nolan's Odyssey, Turning Myth into Fantasy. Motto: in the dark times, will there also be singing? Yes, there will be singing about the dark times. Bertolt Brecht. Because he's the hero the West deserves, but not the one it needs right now. So we'll watch him on IMAX because he can take our money. Because he's not our hero, he's a weeping basket case, an over-medicated narcissist, a dark night of the soul. Me. Well, hi everybody, and the theme today is the concept of myth. And rather than just have endless discussions, I'm sure people are quite Nolan fatigued, but I do think his film just keeps raising more and more issues. But I'm not going to talk about whether it's a good or a bad film. I think my views on that are quite clear by now. What I want to talk about is what he's done to the concept of myth, and not even what he's necessarily done consciously. But I believe that artists of all different stripes and different genres, what they have in common is they're very good at capturing the zeitgeist, the spirit of an age. And I think Nolan in his film has captured our current zeitgeist. So rather than go into the ins and outs, what did he intend? What didn't he intend? Are there hidden messages? I think it's much more interesting to actually look at how his film reflects consciously or subconsciously the values of the time we live in. And in particular today, I wanted to look at, with regard to myth, the Matt Damon Odysseus character, and how arguably, rather than the strong hero of the Homeric Homer's original epic, what you have is this character that is much more redolent of the modern subject, the modern person with all their neuroses. And to address the issue of neuroses, I think it's really useful to look at Freud. Now, Freud, for lots of people, is a massive turn-off, which they're probably in denial. Freud would have a field day. But even if you've never liked Freud, you think Freud's a charlatan, one thing I'd ask you to think about is the extent to which Freud may have described the symptoms of our age brilliantly, and his cure or his solutions might still be awful, if that's your view about psychoanalysis. But I want to concentrate on his analysis of the situation, not specifically Freud, but Freudian ideas. I'll be using a particular academic, Yvonne Sherratt, who in turn interprets a famous essay called Dialectic of Enlightenment by Horkheimer and Adorno. And she uses various Freudian ideas to show how, via Adorno and Horkheimer, how Homer's epic has seeds of the modern issues around things like neurosis and the breakdown of the strong individual subject. And this notion of myth, you can see I could have picked loads of memes, as you can imagine, off the tinternet. But this idea, I found this vaguely amusing. This meme, I don't care what haters say, this is historically accurate, Batman. I chose this to look at just because I think you can get sidetracked by the various anachronisms in the film. For example, I think my worst example would be the spurs on one of the herds. The herdsman walks into the hall and his spurs are clanking, and they just wouldn't have existed in those times. People have got upset about the Viking ship, and why did he pick that when it's, not a Phoenician ship? And there are lots of anachronisms, iron armor in the Bronze Age, the fact they talked about the Bronze Age even though they wouldn't have known at the time that they're in the Bronze Age, and on and on and on. So I'm not going to talk about, now I've talked about them, I'm not going to talk anymore about the anachronisms, and I'm not going to talk about what Christopher Nolan might have intended. I'm much more interested in, irrespective of what he intended, what does Christopher Nolan's film tell us about the zeitgeist we live in, and the fact that because there aren't any traditional values, or that the traditional values like myth and traditional values like religion don't play the dominant part in our society they used to. And for some people, that's great news. But with those absent traditional structures of meaning, we haven't succeeded in replacing those structures with anything substantial. And arguably, what Freud brings to the table is he describes the psychology of a modern subject who lacks traditional sources and references of meaning. And this creates lots of neuroses. And that, I think, whether you like the Nolan film or don't like it, I'm hoping this video shouldn't really, whether you like it or not, shouldn't really affect your response to the video. Because this video is much more interested in the Matt Damon type Odysseus. I think we could all agree is quite different, profoundly different to Homer's original characterization of Odysseus. And that in and of itself is interesting. Some people respond to the more modern resonance and the more modern appropriateness of a completely different character. Some people, which the side I'm on, wished he'd just left the original alone. But irrespective of whatever side you're on, I think he's very accurately, through the Matt Damon character, one of the good things I'd say about the film is he's reflected the neurosis that's very common in our age. And why is that so? Well, that's what I'm going to explore now. So I want to just start with a couple of quotes from the very end of the book, The Matter with Things by Ian McGilchrist. Now, The Matter with Things, and even The Master and His Emissary, which was the first book, a popular book he wrote, is a long book. It's very detailed, and there's a chapter that actually specifically mentions archaic Greece and the psychology and the neurology, the potential neurological relevance of ancient Greek writing. There's a chapter in there. But The Matter with Things is 2 huge volumes, brilliantly researched, goes into so much depth. But in a second, I'm going to give you a couple of quotes from the very end of volume 2, in which he references myth. So I'm not going to have time to mention Ian McGilchrist again, but maybe at the back of your mind as I'm talking, if you're struggling, because later on, it starts off relatively simply. Later on in the second half of this video, I think it gets quite complicated, really trying to get down to the essence of the issue. But to make sense of it, you can always think of, I don't think it's a direct comparison, but you can think it doesn't match perfectly. But if you think of modernity and science and all the things to do with technology as Ian McGilchrist's left brain hemisphere, this wish to control and measure, and the right hemisphere, the way Ian McGilchrist describes it, is much more about patterns and metaphors and the appreciation of more artistic things. So that would be the right hemisphere. And what's interesting is that, like I say, not perfectly, but if you think of myth and religion, they tend to, I would argue, be on the right hemisphere of the brain, that devoted more to things that aren't definite, things that aren't concrete, things that aren't purely measurable. And part of the significance of myth, it was an ancient way of trying to find a balance between the left and right hemisphere, in a way, before they even knew, the brain was divided into 2, like we do with modern science. Similarly, religion, for all its faults, if you're not religious, you might sneer. But religion gives a definite structure, and it helps balance the rational part of us and the emotional part of us, the transcendent part of us. And various writers, I'm going to quickly introduce, just to give more background, various writers have seen this. And I think what Nolan's film does, Christopher Nolan's film, shows what it's like to make myth in a time when myth makes no sense. So I'm going to argue what Christopher Nolan did was make a film about a foundational myth of Western society, and in doing so, he's translated it into the lingua franca of today, which is fantasy, which is illusion, or we'll see shortly, delusion. And I'm not blaming for once Christopher Nolan. I'm suggesting that he's actually in his film reflected very accurately the dominant zeitgeist, the dominant spirit of our time. But in future, I've done stuff on Ian McGilchrist in the past. Hopefully I'll find time in the future. It's just difficult because, like I say, the 2 volumes of The Matter with Things are just so vast and wide-ranging. but he's someone I'll always come back to because I think he gives scientific credibility to wishy-washy, arty-farty people like me. So this is one of the two quotes right at the very end of Volume 2, in the final few pages before the various epilogues and appendices. Just as there is no option to think without metaphor, there is no such thing as not having a myth. Those who think they don't have a myth have merely bought into the prevailing myth of our time, in our case, the myth of the machine, so thoroughly that they are not even aware of it. Our only option is to espouse a worse, or one hopes, a better myth. As the reader will know, I have argued that myths, like metaphors, are by no means lies that are invented, but aspects of truth that are discovered and form an inevitable, indeed crucial part of the search for that truth. Myths oversee or underwrite what we are capable of seeing. The nature of the attention that we bring to bear on the world and the values which we bring to the encounter change what we find, and in some absolutely non-trivial sense change what it is. At the same time, the encounter, as is always the way with encounters, changes who we are. Thus, in addressing the question, who are we, the attention we pay and the values we hold both contribute to the answer which we receive. So I wanted to quote this because I think it's important in a book that's all about neuroscience and goes right to the heart of how we think as human beings. Ian McGilchrist, at the very end of this 2-volume epic, is unambiguous in his defence of myth. And that begs the question, so whether what I say is neither here nor there, but if Ian McGilchrist has done such, a wonderful 2-volume epic, and he's arguing for the importance of myth, what happens in a society like ours, reflected in Christopher Nolan's film, where myth is downgraded to a form of fantasy? And that's what I wanted to look at. So just very quickly, because I can't do full justice, there are various writers I can think of that maybe we'll get to in future that use psychoanalysis as in an interesting way. They use psychoanalysis to examine our culture and society at large. And Norman Brown, he's a bit out there at times, but in this book he has some interesting ideas. And in his work, he has this concept of the Dionysian consciousness, which I've always been interested in. And he's all about overcoming Apollonian repression, or the idea that we're too repressed in modern society. We've lost touch with our deep unconscious self. And one of the aspects of ancient myth and the Dionysian rites and large aspects of ancient culture, the Eleusinian mysteries, and all these things I could talk about endlessly, they had a balance. I always go back to Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy. They were in touch with their Dionysian. They were in touch with the deepest, darkest realms of our psyche, and myth was one part of how they dealt with it. And I'll keep repeating this throughout the video, as modern people, we lack religion, we lack myth. What do we have? And this is one of the problems we face. And then I really do want to look at Philip Reif. I've mentioned him a few times, and there's a range of his books, and he also did one that's not here called Charisma, which is really interesting because charisma defined as the type of revelation from God that the old-fashioned prophets had. But anyway, I'm going to get sidetracked on that if I'm not careful. The Triumph of the Therapeutic. He starts off being quite pro-Freud, and as his career progressed, he became, I think, a bit more critical of Freud, because I think, with reference to the previous point I made, Reif thought that Freud didn't go far enough. He was all about treating our neuroses to help us cope with them, but he didn't have many solutions for the neuroses ultimately. It was a question about managing them. So again, a bit like Norman Brown, it was about how do you actually access our unconscious and do more than just tolerate and maintain it. And the Triumph of the Therapeutic is basically arguing that we live in a society in which therapy speak dominates. And when we get to My Life Among the Deathworks, which is one of my favourite titles for a book, he's basically arguing, it was from a trilogy called Sacred Order, Social Order, And one critic referred to it as like chewing ball bearings. Every once in a while there is a cherry. So it's not an easy read. But his idea is that, and it applies to Christopher Nolan's Odyssey, I would suggest that when you take something away from its original foundational source in modern times, you take all the essence from it. I've always used the example of decaffeinated coffee, which I think is an abominational crime. But you take away the essence and it becomes what he calls a death work. And he argues we live, because we've lost a sacred order and we live in this therapeutic social order, we live among death works, we're surrounded by them. He's basically the theoretical equivalent of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, if you want to think of it that way. And one of the main things I like about Reef is his idea that we've lost transcendent authority. I think he calls it vertical authority. And in the past, there were cultures that had what he calls interdictions. In other words, thou shalt not do this, thou shalt not do that. In Christopher Nolan's film, he takes Xenia, the Greek idea of hospitality, which is very family-based and very rigid and very ritualistic, and he completely reinterprets it. And that would be an example of, in Greek ancient culture, Xenia had a very specific meaning. And when you rephrase it as Zeus's law, as Nolan does, that, I think, in Reef's terms, would be viewed as a death work. Right, so to try and quickly move on, otherwise this could take a long time. But I've mentioned this before, and what I'm going to do is use one specific academic article that I think summarizes some of the key aspects of this book. It's a very complicated, difficult book, but this academic article narrows in on the way in which the individual subject gets broken down by so-called enlightened times modernity. So what I'm going to do is start off with, I used Eleanor Philippou's work in the previous video about the Odyssey to China, and I wanted to use a different bit of work that she's done that was her response. I think it's a guy called Roger Maxon, who gave this apologetic, he made this apologetic video trying to imply that Christopher Nolan had various hidden messages and there was a Christian meaning behind his film. And lots of, I think, Christian apologists have actually seen a lot in Nolan's film that they like. And Eleanor's, I like her cri de coeur, her cry from the heart as a Greek person. She's very in tune with how Greek-specific traditional meaning is being completely gutted. So, and I thought her comment was very useful. I'm about to show you in a second, but she basically says, why would you want Christopher Nolan's postmodern interpretation of a hero in Matt Damon's Odysseus? And after I've shown her complaints, I then want to try and show whether Christopher Nolan meant it or not. Christopher Nolan has presented this postmodern Matt Damon Odysseus character because he genuinely reflects our time. And I want to go deep into what has happened to our psychology, what has turned us into the type of narcissistic Matt Damon type character. And Freud has not the cure, I would suggest, not the solution by any means, but I think actually the Freudian terms that Adorno and Horkheimer use in this book, and Yvonne Charrat, the academic who adopts their analysis and takes it further, I think Freud is incredibly useful. So this is Eleanor's Philippou's cri de coeur, I'd phrase it. And the original YouTube video, if you want to check it out, that she was responding to was I Figured Out Nolan's Odyssey by a guy called Roger Maxon, who I believe, apologies if I've misremembered, was a Baptist former minister. So he gives quite a Christian approach. So I am Greek, so she gets that there right from the get-go. And I must admit, if I was Greek, I think I'd be spitting feathers. And I think that you are missing the decoding of the Odyssey. Needless to say, Nolan and the rest of his clowns also did. The Odyssey, um, isn't this slightly rude to have everything in uppercase? But I'm with Eleanor. I'm annoyed as well. The Odyssey is the journey of human soul to its divinization. The Homeric Odysseus bears no resemblance whatsoever to Nolan's Odysseus, and frankly, I cannot see why a postmodern version is needed. And this is what I wanted to focus in on, what I've just emboldened, and frankly, I cannot see why a postmodern version is needed. I don't want to defend Christopher Nolan, but I'd almost say to Eleanor, it's not that it was needed. Again, I just think Christopher Nolan is reflecting the zeitgeist of our time. And in the interview he did in China that I talked about in the previous video, because he's a product of the culture industry, because he's a product of Hollywood, he actually explicitly states in that interview he wants to give the audience what he thinks they can handle. And I think he's providing the audience with Matt Damon's Odysseus with a character that reflects their time. I'm totally in agreement with Eleanor that I don't think he should have done it. But why he did it is becoming increasingly apparent to me. I don't even think it was particularly manipulative or strategic. I think he just, like most very good artists, can't help capturing the zeitgeist. Homeric Odysseus is polymekanos and polytropos, the man of many ways and many devices, who never forgets his identity, his roots, or his destination, his nostos. And this is where I formerly said nous, I mispronounced it. It's more like a Scottish nous. But nous, in my defence, is a Liverpool word that's often used, taken from the Greek. So I always was brought up to say nous. But nous, mind, and estia, home, meaning that your home is nous, that your mind has all the enlightenment qualities, and your journey is towards realising the nature of your mind, is what is embedded in every single human. So his nostos is what is embedded in every single human. And this concept of the journey. So Eleanor is very much of the school that the whole point of Homer's Odyssey is, yes, it's about an actual literal journey, but much more metaphorically, it's about the search for enlightenment. And Nikos, I can never remember his name, Kazantzakis, I think it is, the guy who did the modern sequel in the 1930s, was it? It's a huge 33,000 line reinterpretation. He misses out the final scene of Homer's Odyssey. He picks up where Odysseus has just killed all the suitors, and then he writes his version of what would happen. And it's very much more in keeping with Eleanor's idea of this journey to find the nature of our own mind. Yet Nolan's Odysseus wanders about like a man crippled by post-traumatic stress, willingly eats the lotus offered by Calypso in order to forget his roots and his purpose. He no longer knows who he is. Could he be us? Could he be the foreigners? What he wants, or even where he wishes to go? And this is a classic example of what Thomas Sars, I've referred to in previous videos, would just refer to as the over-medicalization of mental illness. Then, almost by accident, he recovers his kingdom. Yet he is so stupid that does not understand what that restoration signifies, according to Homer, that, consumed by guilt, a guilt continually reinforced by who he believes is the goddess Athena, he takes Penelope and voluntarily exiles himself, or what I say, he goes on a boomer cruise. Why do we need a postmodern Odysseus? Which of the two would you prefer to be? And again, not that I'm pushing back against Eleanor, but I don't think it's a question of who you'd prefer to be. I think it's a question of who is Christopher Nolan representing. What literally no one does is take into account the symbolism of the Odyssey. Homer did not just write an adventure poem. Take the symbolism of the destination. Homer's coded meaning of Ithaca as the realm of the noetic fields, Ithake, the ethos, where one finds after they are cured from all the noetic or the mind's poisons our ego brings about. And that's a crucial sentence I should have emboldened. From all the mind's poisons our ego brings about, that's what I'm going to be discussing with the subsequent slides, all about Freud, which again, people may get turned off by Freud, but I think he explains Eleanor's point here brilliantly. Where man, having consciously chosen and traversed the path of arete or virtue, ultimately achieves theosis or divinization. If we understand Penelope's code as well, the purified, virtuous soul whom Odysseus never once forgot, then the abandonment of Ithaca becomes an even greater paradox. In fact, it is impossible. Where exactly is he supposed to go? I've told you he's on a cruise. If there existed a higher stage of human development beyond Ithaca, if Ithaca were not the very realization of the human, would Homer not have given his hero another destination? What then are we even discussing here? And again, I think Kazantzakis, Nikos Kazantzakis, his version does explore what would happen if Homer left Ithaca, but it's still within Eleanor's idea of a way of finding ultimate enlightenment. So it's not going against Eleanor's point, it's just taking it in a slightly different direction. Only someone who neither understood nor ever wished to understand the Odyssey could either produce such a distortion, a postmodern Odysseus as you call him, or wish to become Nolan's Odysseus, or both. As for that despicable treatment of Zeus's sacred law, Xenia, hospitality, which the film deliberately dismantles. In Homer, Zeus and the gods punish the invader, the one who violates the sanctity of another man's household property and hospitality. This is precisely why Athena assists Odysseus in killing the suitors, all of them. Likewise, Telemachus executes Penelope's disloyal maids. Athena is not the pacifist figure who burdens Odysseus with guilt because he used violence against some, but notably not all, of the suitors, as she is portrayed in Nolan's Odyssey. If we once again consider the symbolism embedded in the names of the suitors, the point becomes even clearer. The goddess of wisdom, strategy, and justice cannot permit an anti-nous, so Antinous in the film, against the mind, an amphinomos, double-minded, always hesitant and morally weak, and a Eurymachus, a wide fighter, constantly struggling for domination, or indeed any one of the 108 symbolic corruptors of the soul to survive within the perfect noetic realm, or noetic realm. Nor can there remain maids who willingly surrender themselves to the passions represented by those who were plundering Odysseus' kingdom. For arete and dikeosune and sophrosune, so virtue, justice, and self-mastery arise only when man ceases to submit to his passions, his spirited impulses, and his appetites. The Odyssey is Homer's gift to humanity. He wrote about the journey we all take towards liberation and enlightenment, the struggles that our fears and our desires pose, the hardships of the path of virtue, what it takes to get back home, be the masters of our kingdom and ourselves. So sorry, where are we? This is where I want to go on from here. He wrote about the journey we all take towards liberation and enlightenment. So this is the jumping off point. So this was the last paragraph that Eleanor wrote in this post, I think, or the one I've used. And like I say, this is the jumping off point. So this is the article of von Scherat, The Dialectic of Enlightenment, a Contemporary Reading. So just to re-emphasize and be crystal clear, I want to take Eleanor's argument that the Odyssey is really about a search for enlightenment, and then show that according to Adorno and Horkheimer via von Scherat, the problem is the modern person, their whole approach to enlightenment is defeated before it even begins, because modern society operates under a false sense of enlightenment. And it'll take a while, but that's this notion of a pseudo-enlightenment, an enlightenment that is actually reverts to the myth it tried to replace, is actually worse than the myth it tried to replace. Because as Eleanor has pointed out in those previous slides and the previous video in which I quoted her, ancient Greek myth has so many layers. It serves this brilliantly metaphorical, spiritual, multi-layered approach through its narratives to how human beings can manage their passions and engage with the natural world. So it's this balance of the Apollonian and the Dionysian. And this is what Nietzsche writes about with reference to Greek tragedy that came after Homer's epics. So at some point, I've been meaning to look at Euripides and various tragedies, and it would be interesting to do that, to build upon some of these points. So Adorno's concept of enlightenment denotes a very particular kind of culture, one that is characterized by a certain set of aims. The principal aim of the Enlightenment is the acquisition of knowledge. Now this, I've emphasized, I've emboldened it, because this is the key to why arguably modern people are so confused and unhappy. Because our sense of enlightenment, rather than the Buddhist or the ancient Greek or even the Christian idea of seeking enlightenment through redemption in the Christian way, or seeking nirvana, or whatever religions, different religions have different paths to different types of enlightenment. The modern enlightenment, the enlightenment that's used to refer to the growth of scientific knowledge and rational discourse, that is about the acquisition of knowledge. But this is the misleading aspect. In reality, Adorno and Horkheimer say it's not actually about the acquisition of knowledge for its own sake. It's only about the acquisition of knowledge insofar as that knowledge can be used to control and to manage and to accumulate, in Ian McGilchrist's terms, all the left hemisphere aspects of calculation and measurement, rather than the more well-rounded interaction of the left and right hemispheres of the brain. Knowledge acquisition turns out, in fact, not to be an aim of the Enlightenment at all, but to be a mere means that the Enlightenment uses in order to attain its other aims. The Enlightenment is thus mistaken about the role of its purported foremost aim. Because knowledge acquisition turns out not to be an end but a means, Adorno refers to it as instrumental knowledge acquisition. So instrumental reason is a famous notion within critical theory, not the critical theory that now dominates higher education, I must emphasize, but the actual original critical theory that actually had some intellectual heft behind it. The Enlightenment self-conception is formed in contrast with what Adorno believes the Enlightenment regards as another kind of culture, that of myth. Adorno writes, the program of the Enlightenment was the disenchantment of the world, the dissolution of myths, and the substitute of knowledge for fancy. Mythic culture is permeated by a certain set of attitudes which differ from the Enlightenment in that they are not derived from a set of aims. Myth does not, according to Adorno, set out with any aims at all. As a culture, it simply is what it is, and it is centered around a way of relating to the world which is animistic. Now, I'm pretty confident Eleanor and other Greek scholars would argue that this is a reductionist interpretation of ancient Greek myth. I've already alluded to the various ways in which it's more subtle than that. But if you just recognize for a second, even if he's using a straw man, Adorno is just contrasting enlightenment, which is all about the explicit pursuit of knowledge, and myth, which even at its very worst reductionist aspect, like Adorno's describing, is more about finding ways to deal with the here and now, rather than constantly seeking to control it I think that would be a useful distinction. For Adorno, instrumental knowledge acquisition is inherently inadequate, which is to say that not only does it fail to have the quality of being an end in itself, but relatedly, it fails also as a means. That instrumental knowledge acquisition is inadequate as an instrument results in the Enlightenment declining into myth. So this is slightly complicated, but I'm going to go through it in detail in the next number of slides. But the notion that instrumental knowledge acquisition is inadequate as an instrument. So he argues as we go along, Adorno suggests that this desire to control, this left hemisphere Ian McGilchrist type idea, to measure, to control, to use technical scientific method to the exclusion of everything else. He argues that it's overdone to the point at which it becomes irrational. It becomes counterproductive. So it even begins to fail as an instrument. A large factor as to why instrumental knowledge acquisition fails as a means is because of a distinctive kind of subjectivity that, according to Adorno, underlies it. So this is a secondary point to the statement I've just made. Along with this desire to control everything, this has an effect on the individual's psychology. If I was going to give a really short summary to try and cut to the chase, it would be instrumental knowledge acquisition. It may seem a stretch, but according to Adorno, ultimately it turns us all into raging narcissists. And narcissism is just, I'm fascinated by online. It's such a popular topic. People can't seem to get enough of the topic of narcissism. But this, according to Adorno at least, he goes right to the heart of why he at least thinks narcissism becomes a standard psychological quality of modern individuals. So this is how he explains it, and this is where the Freudian stuff come in. And I would be interested in the comments. For anyone who's never really liked Freud, how convinced they are by this use of Freudian concepts to describe what's going on, and by extension, how impressed or not impressed you are with a Freudian explanation of why Christopher Nolan made the film the way he did, why Matt Damon is the type of character that he is. So, and just to repeat, I made this point at the beginning, but I think it's important to repeat and underline it. The idea is that not that Freud has brilliant solutions, and if we all go off to Freudian psychoanalysts, we'll be cured of the modern condition. I'm not claiming that at all. I'm quite cynical myself about the usefulness. But to what extent is Freud useful to diagnose the nature of the problem? So he may not be useful for curing neurotic people, but perhaps his theory is very useful for describing how we became neurotic. And this is how the subsequent slides go on to try and explain that. So the ego refers to the part of the self that is responsible for self-preservation, capable of control and gaining a sense of reality. The id is the more primitive aspect that is uncontrolled and concerned with pleasure. So that's a crucial setup, that's a crucial distinction. In his later work, Freud moved from talking about parts of the self and conceived of the self as something driven by drives. Drive-driven. Drives, according to Freud, form the basis of the individual's action. They emerge out of the ego when they are referred to as the reality principle, and out of the id when they are referred to as the libido. So the ego part of us is, again in Ian McGilchrist type terms, is the part of our brain and our psyche that focuses upon external reality. And the modern ego, as we go on to see, is all about controlling and shaping and dominating external reality. This is the reality principle. And out of the id, when they are referred to as the libido, so the drives that come from your id aren't drives to control. They're not drives to get loads of instrumentally useful information. The id, I'm trying to think of ways to express the id. It's basically the slavering animal I become when I see pictures of Sydney Sweeney if I was put into an aversion therapy clinic or whatever. This idea of instinctual slavering drives. Quickly moving on. And it leads to a loss of sense of reality, and this again is an important thing. In ancient, my emphasis upon myth and the importance of ancient Greek myth, or later on Christianity, they provide structures that allow us to try and make sense of reality with a balance of the id and the ego. What happens as we go into advanced modernity is we lose that balance. We get rid of myth, whether it's religious or ancient Greek, and we replace it with something that doesn't fit the bill. An important characteristic of drives is that they have an aim, and their aim is an object. Freud writes, the object of a drive is the thing in regard to which or through which the drive is able to achieve its aim. The id seeks out an object in order to satisfy its aim of pleasure, whereas the ego seeks out an object in order to satisfy its aim of self-preservation. So one way to see Odysseus is that the whole Odyssey, the way in which Adorno and Horkheimer interpret it is, it's the beginning of the Western modern rise of subjectivity as encapsulated within Odysseus. He begins to seek knowledge. So nothing Eleanor said I think is wrong. That Homer's intending it to be a story about the path to enlightenment. It's an odyssey to find himself. But the way in which Adorno and Horkheimer rightly or wrongly interpret it is, they suggest there are the beginnings of, the signs of modern subjectivity in which the need to control and the need for knowledge acquisition begins to take on too much of a dominant force so that the balance becomes out of whack. The object of the drives is predominantly external reality, although it can sometimes abnormally be the self or even illusions. And this is crucial here. This is how things begin to go wrong. So normally the drives are about external reality. To help understand the subsequent slides I'm going to show that do get a bit complicated, this is what I've emphasized, I've emboldened. Things begin to go wrong when the objects of the drive stops being about external reality and starts becoming the self or even illusions created by the self. And to jump ahead, to try and give you some way of anchoring this in your own experience, the way in which increasingly people live online, social media driven lives. That would be an example of suddenly your drives for objects, the object of the drives that you might have had, become increasingly immaterial. They're screen based. They're not based in any external reality. And that leads to, as we'll see, more and more growing narcissism and the way in which the object of our drives becomes not real things, but actual illusions. And the final stage is not even illusions, but delusions. And I'll explain the distinction in a minute. So the meaning associated with the id, if we call that B, and the meaning we associate with the ego as A, if you can keep that in mind, the satisfaction of these drives upon their object leads to different consequences and thus to a different kind of experience of the object. For the id, it leads to pleasure and a kind of meaning that we're calling meaning B. So with the id, these instinctual drives, these things deep within us that aren't really rational, they're not really conscious, they're our instincts, or they're things beyond our full rational control. These are things that give us pleasure. And from that pleasure, objects, or we'll see in a minute, activities we engage in the outside world, the external world, we derive meaning from the pleasure that they give us. For instance, Freud argues that a vocation, I always thought I had a vocation as a teacher, which will probably amuse you if you're bored senseless by this point, but gains its meaning to the person employed in it through the pleasure that person derives from it. Art gains its meaning, Freud argues, through the pleasure derived from the experience of beauty, and another person becomes deeply meaningful because of the pleasure of sexual love. So these are all ways in which meaning is derived from the id, which is derived from the pleasure experienced through interacting with aspects of reality. So this kind of meaning is distinct from that associated with knowledge. So unsurprisingly, the id, the meaning derived from the id, is much more. I'm trying to think of a good analogy. If you're familiar with James Joyce's Ulysses, Leopold Bloom, that character, is very earthy, very physical. He loves his food. He even likes, I think, is it pork kidney at the beginning of the book he eats, and he says it has a nice tang of urine that he can still detect in the meat. So he's fixated upon food, which would be the type of id meaning. Stephen Dedalus is much more rational, he's much more intellectual, and he gets pleasure from his intellectual knowledge and his intellectual pursuits. So it's not a direct explanation, but I think that might illustrate. So we go back to Ian McGilchrist. It means knowledge acquisition is bound up with the feature of control. This is a categorizing kind of meaning. It occurs within propositional statements insofar as these statements refer to objects in the external world. It is also related to the use or function of an item. And we'll get to it, but I need to get it off my chest. The way I always see this is, I've always in my life hated bureaucracy. I've hated technocracy. And when I worked in universities, one of the weird things was when you had to do a bit of bureaucracy, if you weren't careful, there is a way in which you actually begin to enjoy the process for its own sake. It's quite seductive because it feels safe, you're in control, because it's almost like a warm, womb-like structure, bureaucracy. You can stop other people doing things and you can just do backstroke in the sea of indolent bureaucracy. And it has a meaning, but the meaning isn't really going anywhere. I think that's a good description of bureaucracy. It's self-reflecting, pointless meaning. And I think this is where this breakdown, this distinction between meaning A and meaning B, I think this is where it eventually ends up. Adorno's central use of Freud is the following. Enlightenment is defined by its aims, which depend upon the acquisition of knowledge. The definitive experience of enlightenment, therefore, becomes the acquisition of knowledge. This entails for Adorno, following Freud, the subject satisfies itself upon the object through the ego drive. Thus, for Adorno, the ego drive is predominant in enlightenment. And this is where it gets, I hope, there's a lot of background there, but it's needed to get to these crucial aspects. So why does the Enlightenment fail ultimately? And the implications of this is, you and I, people caught up within modernity, there are 4 stages that account for the reason why someone like Christopher Nolan would choose or direct Matt Damon in the way he did and wrote him the role of Odysseus as a needy, not particularly heroic character. So there are 4 key stages. So one, and these are all Yvonne Sherritt's way of interpreting Adorno. So impoverishment, Odysseus is the self who always restrains himself. So the Sirens episode in the Odyssey, One aspect of impoverishment is you don't get to experience full reality. So in the Eleusinian mysterious rites, the Orphic rites, the Dionysian rites, there's a way of bacchanalian letting yourself go. So Bacchus, the god of wine, it's this idea, there are all these different traditions in the Roman and Greek versions, but the idea of letting yourself go, getting into a frenzy in some type of epiphanic religious experience, these are the things that increasingly are absent from an inverted commas enlightened modernity. So with the sirens, remember Odysseus has himself tied to the mast, and the rowers, his men, have their ears filled with wax. So the metaphorical meaning is part of modernity and part of progress is that you get where you want to go, but you're not experiencing things in their true essence the way you might have previously. And then the fantasy, this is where we go right back to the title, the subtitle of this talk. When myth becomes fantasy, the id is unmoored from reality and it begins to feed on illusions, and I'll explain how that happens. Totalization is when the ego dominates the id completely. So I mentioned earlier the need for balance. When totalization happens, the rational ego, the left hemisphere in Ian McGilchrist's terms, dominates the right hemisphere, and the id is dominated completely. And then there's fragmentation. This describes the postmodern subject that Eleanor is complaining about. The ego fixates upon itself and fears the external world. And in terms of modern contemporary ideology, the way in which, in the guise of tolerance, there are many cultural ideologies at the moment that will not tolerate dissent. In the guise of tolerance, nothing is tolerated. If you slightly question, you're a bigot, you're a phobe. There is no room for dissent. The ideology is absolute. So I'll go through them step by step. So impoverishment. Odysseus, in order to keep a ship on course, must avoid being drawn in by the sirens singing. To achieve this, he plugs the ears of the rowers so that they should not be exposed to the temptation of the song. He has himself tied to the mast from where he can hear the song, but is secure from the danger of responding to it. Adorno explains how Odysseus oppresses the impulse for pleasure of his fellow humans. The rowers whose ears are plugged cannot even hear the song. Odysseus also suppresses his own pleasure in rendering himself unable to jump overboard and submerge himself in the music. In being unable to respond to the sirens, Odysseus receives only a diluted experience of their song. Both he and the rowers, therefore, virtually, know only the song's danger and nothing of its beauty. The price of Odysseus's control, quite simply, is an impoverishment of pleasure. So various aspects of modernity dilute our experience. Impoverishment encompasses a loss of sensual pleasure. Odysseus cannot submerge himself completely in the sensuality of the siren song. It also entails a restriction of the imagination. Furthermore, the capacity for self-abandonment is lost. Whereas primitive man experienced the natural thing merely as the evasive object of desire, Odysseus cannot yield to the temptation to self-abandonment. Finally, as the faculties of response to beauty decline, so too does the actual existence of beauty. The lack of appreciation of the siren song results in a depreciation of the song itself. And ultimately, when people are discussing, I notice a lot of people when they're discussing Christopher Nolan's film are talking about the loss of immersion and all the anachronisms I mentioned earlier. But I think this actually, on this slide, this describes the essence of Eleanor's complaint. The depreciation of the song itself. And remember, the original bards were called singers. And the idea is the version that we've got, the Hollywood version, is a depreciation of the song itself. And I think this is one of the major disagreements between those who like the film and those who don't. The constant refrain of the defenders of the film is it's just a film. Christopher Nolan can do what he wants with his adaptation. What's the problem? And I think the Eleanors of this world, and I'm in the same camp, it's if people realised how depreciated the original song was and then said, we prefer the depreciated version. So if some deviant person says, I prefer seriously, zero alcohol beer and decaffeinated coffee, you can only defer to their complete lack of taste and say, well, that's their subjective opinion. But they'd have to know and appreciate in order to then reject the original coffee and the original full alcohol beer. To prefer something whilst not knowing what the original was is, I think, Eleanor can speak for herself, but please shout out in the comments, Eleanor. But for me, that's what is the major disagreement. It's people taking a strong stand on something they haven't been able to appreciate in the first place. So it's not that they don't appreciate Homer. They just don't know what they're not appreciating because they haven't been exposed to its essence for all the reasons Ellen has pointed out, both in this talk and the previous one. So, and I love the way, this is just a little snippet of how Adorno and Horkheimer write, which I think is beautiful. The sirens have their own quality, but in primitive bourgeois history it is neutralized to become merely the wistful longing of the passer-by. The epic says nothing of what happened to the sirens once the ship had disappeared. In tragedy, however, it would have been their last hour. So what Adorno and Horkheimer are saying is, because of the inverted commas clever way Odysseus stopped himself being taken up by the siren song, from then on, humankind became increasingly immune to the siren song. So it would have been their last hour. The sirens basically die a death because of the type of tactics Odysseus employed, which would be meaning A in the previous slides. So this leads on to fantasy. So I'm arguing myth has been turned into fantasy. As a consequence of the increasing loss of reality as an object, Freud explains a likely outcome. When the connection with reality is loosened, satisfaction is obtained from illusions. The id thus seeks an alternative object. It turns, in fact, to illusion. Freud argues that the earliest stage of human development is that of infantile narcissism. In this condition, the self, not properly formed, is unable to discriminate between the internal and the external. One aspect of this lack of discrimination encompasses an inability to discern between sensations derived from objects in the external world and the self's own impulses or wishes. The self in such a primitive condition simply wishes and then satisfies its drives upon these wishes. So, I mentioned earlier the modern contemporary obsession with narcissism. But what's being described here is, I think in psychoanalytical terms, let's say a baby's being fed breast milk, so the baby's at the breast. And just for information's sake, I was bottle fed, which explains a lot of my lifelong neuroses, I'm sure. But if a baby's being breastfed, the theory is they don't know until their brain properly develops. They think basically themselves and the breast are the universe. And they don't distinguish particularly between themselves and the breast. And some men never grow out of it either. But the idea is that they then, for example, let's say they're hungry and they cry and the breast appears and they're fed. They then also associate their wish and their desire for milk as some type of, because I wished it, it happened, because they have no ability to realise the mother responded to the baby crying. So the self in such a primitive condition simply wishes and then satisfies its drives upon these wishes. And you could apply this to the modern context. Increasingly, people's ideological position is such, they wish something to be true, therefore it is. And I'm sure you can think of examples for yourself. In the adult self, this process can also occur. The adult self projects its wishes outward. It either projects them onto an external object, converting it into what the id would wish it to be, or its wishes reside within the imagination without forming an attachment to any external object. The objects of these wishes are illusions. Hence, illusions are generated from the id's own impulses. They are projections masquerading as in the external world. Illusion is thus a feature of a primitive stage of the self's development, and any reversion to it in adult life is a regression. And again, you could argue many people in the modern world live in a state of illusion because of things like widespread ubiquitous social media and screen existence. And I'm trying to give a sense of, I'm partly joking in what I'm about to say, but it's also, there's an element of truth. So my obsession with Sydney Sweeney, let's stick to that. Demented as it is, and it's illusionary, because if I'm honest with myself, I don't think I have much of a chance. There, I've said it. But she's a real woman in the real world. But it would be illusionary to think I was ever going to go out with her. But I've mentioned in the past, if you think back to Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Jessica Rabbit, I would argue, is a hyper-idealized male fantasy of a woman with a ridiculously thin waist and everything else pneumatically features. At least an obsession with Sydney Sweeney would be, almost, if it's not an oxymoron, a realistic illusion. Whereas Jessica Rabbit is an illusionary illusion. And the point I'm clumsily trying to make is, I think more people are having illusions along the Jessica Rabbit lines these days than the Sydney Sweeney, even though having illusions about Sydney Sweeney would still be an illusion. In the stage of enlightenment, that is impoverishment, the id can no longer satisfy itself upon the external world. As a result, it turns to generate illusions in order to satisfy itself. We can term this condition of the id satisfying itself by illusion a state of fantasy. In the stage of the enlightenment that I have termed fantasy, the ego satisfies itself upon reality, whilst the id generates its own illusions. Half of the self is thus engaged upon the world, half not. The self is split. So this self is split. That's the loss of balance. The ancient Greeks with their tragedy had a balance between the Dionysian and the Apollonian. We've lost that. This encompasses a regress. Half of the self is turning away from reality towards itself as its object. It's reverting to a more primitive state of human development. Freud terms this condition narcissism, as it is a reversion to a condition akin to infantile narcissism. And again, to try and cut through all the technical language, I only ever used Facebook initially because I was working on an academic journal, an online journal, and we needed to contact, my co-editor and I, we needed to contact subscribers, and we found out the easiest way was through Facebook. And on Facebook, so I've very rarely ever used it, I'm very rarely ever on it, but I've noticed people, their notion of their own identity, whether it's about gender identity or even just taking endless selfies of themselves in the gym, the notion of the self as an object that they work upon as a project, they're constantly talking about it. They're constantly photographing themselves. They're constantly creating an online persona. I see it as this primitive state of human development, this reversion to a condition akin to infantile narcissism. So then he goes, Yvonne Sherritt goes on. An instance of this regress of the id drives to fantasies given by Adorno through his account of Odysseus' experience of the Lotus Eaters. So this is arguably the most significant part of Christopher Nolan's film as well, that Matt Damon is on the island with Calypso, voluntarily, Eleanor pointed out earlier, voluntarily saying, give me more lotus flower, I want to forget. And obviously addiction is a massive epidemic in modern society. People need to find ways to forget. The lotus is a source of obvious pleasure. Homer described it as sweeter than honey. However, unlike the Song of the Sirens, the lotus, according to Adorno, does not embody any reality content. And this is crucial. Whereas the Sirens knew everything that has happened on this so fruitful earth, including the events in which Odysseus himself took part, eating lotus is a pleasure that is wholly disconnected from reality. It's a kind of idyll which recalls the happiness of narcotic drug addicts reduced to its lowest level. I mean, you could think of Aldous Huxley's Soma, isn't it, in Brave New World. Because of this lack of reality content in the Lotus Eater's experience, the pleasure itself, according to Adorno, is actually the mere illusion of happiness. The pleasure is the mere production of infantile wish impulses and the satisfaction of the id upon these. This condemns the Lotus Eaters to no more than to a primitive state. I'm risking it now because I'm going to say, only from personal experience, I've hardly ever played computer games. But whenever I have, I totally admit it can be very addictive. So let's say very few hours in my life I've ever spent doing it. But even remember when I tried, let's say you spent an hour on a video game, I would remember having an empty feeling after the end of that hour. Because it's the difference between stimulation and what you could call edification. You might be totally stimulated for the hour of video game playing, but it's rare that you've changed as a person, because what's stimulated is what was already within you. Whereas reading a great novel, going to the theatre, doing something significant in the external world has the potential to change you as a person. You're not the same person, even if it's only in a tiny, relatively insignificant way. And apologies if loads of game players say, oh, well, you've misunderstood. Games are really complicated and, blah, blah, blah. It might be true, but if not games, I'm sure you can think of other examples of activities that are mostly, if not only, about stimulation. They're not about changing as a person. So according to Adorno's analysis, when illusion becomes the new source of pleasure, because pleasure is inherently linked to meaning B, which is the id, then illusion also, of course, becomes the new source of meaning. Illusions therefore come to replace reality, not merely as a source of pleasure, but as a source of this kind of meaning. This marks a further regress. Illusions for Adorno, following Freud, are infantile fantasies which are intrinsically meaningless. Therefore, when they become experienced as meaningful, that which is intrinsically meaningless comes to be taken as meaningful. This is a state of delusion. And if I really wanted to wind people up, if there are enthusiastic game players who then defend game playing, when I say game players, online game players, this emboldened bit might be what they're in denial about. Delusion is even more regressive than illusion. It occurs in the instance of lotus eaters when their experience is like yet unlike the realization of utopia. That is, their experience begins to imitate utopia, but lacks the meaning of the id that such experience would hold. So there's an emotional investment in the experience that's lacking. It's, as I said before, it's mostly about illusionary stimulus rather than substantial emotional change. Right, I'm nervous now. I've upset all the gamers. Ho hum. The Enlightenment at this stage, as we have seen, consists of a split which entails that only half the self's drives relate to reality. The other half are deployed on mere illusion. So the cultural correspondence of this psychological split is a society made up on the one hand of enormous technical power and efficiency, and on the other of depleted illusory pleasures and meanings. So the games get ever more complicated and technically brilliant, as does cinema, but the actual depth of meaning and deep emotional pleasure is lacking. Enlightenment is comprised of split halves, only one of which is enlightened. For Adorno, the state of fantasy marks two aspects of decline. First, the pleasure-driven part of culture regresses through neglect. The subject regresses from maturity to immaturity, and pleasure becomes composed of delusional meanings. There is a second and deeper regression, because the delusion within fantasy feeds back to affect the realm of enlightenment proper, so that delusions start to occupy the realm of knowledge. So sorry, but I'll go back. This, I think, explains the delusion within fantasy feeds back to affect the realm of enlightenment proper, so that delusions start to occupy the realm of knowledge. So if you've ever been disillusioned, so to speak, with any politician, the way in which politicians, technocrats in the modern world, they create fake expertise. They pretend to have some type of knowledge that nobody else has. And yet they don't seem to ever produce any outcomes that nobody else could. It all becomes part of almost like an enlightenment Ponzi scheme. So economics, I got an my first degree was economics and politics, so a large component was economics. And that always struck me as the most bizarre pseudoscience. But this is what happens. Enlightenment becomes more and more illusionary, the knowledge itself. And then we move on to the third stage of totalization. So in the stage of fantasy, the only set of drives engaged upon reality were those of the ego. According to Adorno, in the stage of totalization, these grow more and more powerful and exert more and more control over the id. As a result, the id drives become more restricted, such that eventually they become unable to generate wish objects or fantasies. That is, the enlightenment subject becomes increasingly unable to generate illusions. So totalization helps explain why entities like Hollywood, we become so emptied out as people. We're unable to generate our own illusions. We then, sheep-like, begin to feed off the illusions that are given to us. So Adorno writes, with the technical easing of life, the persistence of domination brings about a fixation of the drives by means of heavier repression. Imagination atrophies. So people become more sheep-like, people copy each other. And someone mentioned in the comments, would I be looking at René Girard, who I will be, but he had this idea of, how do you say it? Mimesis, M-I-M-E-S-I-S, mimesis, copying, imitation. He had a whole theory of this, and arguably that's what happens in a technological society. The mimesis gets worse and worse and worse. However, the drive of the id, if weakened, persists. What therefore can it turn to in order to attain satisfaction? In fact, there is a readily available object for the id to satisfy itself upon. In its predominance, the ego has generated a complex web of instrumental knowledge, a world of science, logic, technical designs and processes. This complex technical system is a readily available object. The id, in fact, turned to this for satisfaction. Thus, in the third stage of the Enlightenment, the ego, that is in fact the technological system of knowledge produced by the ego, becomes the new object for the id. What are the put my teeth back in. What are the results of this? We know that the id has the characteristic of experiencing objects in terms of pleasure. Therefore, when the ego's products become the object of the id, instrumentality becomes a source of pleasure. So for those that have seen the live stream, Stuart's obsession with techno music and electronic music, this would put him in this category. Shame on you, Stuart. Once instrumental abstraction replaces fantasy as the object for the id, then experience loses distinctions. The ego drives are the only way of relating to reality itself. And although the id drives remain, they neither relate to reality nor do they even They neither relate to reality nor do they even any longer generate their own object. They can experience the ego only as object. Thus, on the one hand, the ego provides the only way of experiencing reality, and on the other, it has come to replace reality as the experiential realm for any other aspect of the self. So just in an increasingly technological, totalized, instrumentally abstract environment, the ego just turns inwards, and quelle surprise, we live in a society of increasingly rampant infantile narcissism. So in social media, I'd argue it's almost like a marketplace of egos all competing with their monopolizing lived experience. Now, ordinarily, the self relates to the other through both its drive, so that the other is potentially pleasurable and meaningful, so the meaning you get from the id, B, as well as potentially harmful. At the stage of totalization, however, now that the ego's products are the only source of pleasure and meaning, and external reality is devoid of these qualities, then the world is no longer a source of significant and pleasurable experience, but is only threatening. Adorno argues that this sense of threat reaches paranoid proportions, so that the enlightened self fears obsessively everything that is not self. And I do understand that the COVID period of time was atypical and exceptional. But the way in which it's negatively affected a whole generation of young people, whereby I remember reading an article saying in British pubs, young people are... I know table service, which never used to really be a thing in British pubs, has become more of a thing. But many more young people, because they can use apps, I've got out of the habit of even ordering a drink from a bar person and interacting. And this feeds upon itself, the shyness, being cut off from social contact at a formative stage. Again, you could say this was an aberration, the whole COVID thing, but you could also see it as an extreme example of underlying tendencies that have been there for quite a while. This fear is at root a fear of difference, a sense that the different will annihilate the self's identity. It expresses itself in several ways. One is an attempt to remove the threat. Adorno argues that this can manifest itself in a drive for the destruction of difference. It can be a drive for the destruction of external reality or any perceived other. And again, this goes back to the irony. In a progressive cultural climate where tolerance is supposed to be the dominant value, anyone who questions the dominant ideology of tolerance becomes a dangerous other that has to be cancelled. Cancel culture arose within this atmosphere that's being described. Epistemologically, this manifests itself, Adorno claims, in the rigid closed systems of logic which are concerned with their own internal rules and reject all that lies without, again, modern ideology. These, Adorno argues, are a kind of megalomaniac dominance. The system is the belly turned mind, which is a beautiful phrase. It eliminates all heterogeneous being. Again, I've encountered certain demographics whose opinions are herd-like, bovine, depressingly so. It is a philosophical devouring which leaves nothing outside of its own system. It equates reality with itself, thereby exterminating any potential external different reality. And the corollary of this is, if you wish something to be so, that becomes what you've identified as what is, and what you've identified as what is becomes what is. This tautological wish fulfillment. So we're getting there towards the end now, don't worry. It's been a long one, but I just wanted to do this academic article full justice. So the final category, fragmentation, on this downward slide to modern, postmodern nihilism. The relationship that the subject has with the external world at the end of the stage of totalization and the onset of the stage of fragmentation is solely through the ego drives. This is a relationship where fear has led to the attempt to exterminate all that is external to the self. If successful, this leads, of course, to the loss of all that is external, including the external world as the object for the ego. The only remaining object, therefore, becomes the ego itself. So when you cancel history, when you cancel experience of the classics, when you don't get exposed to great art, great literature, when you live in an increasingly screen-based, fragmented, solipsistic, I'm trying to think of all these words, it's this never-ending self-referentiality of these reflected images of people who look just like you, even if superficially, ethnically, for example, they're diverse. It's the same mental attitudes, it's the same styles they're all subscribing to. The only remaining object, therefore, becomes the ego itself. Previously, the ego drives protected themselves against the external world. When the ego becomes the only object of experience, these drives turn to protect themselves against the ego. The combination of a loss of pleasure and meaning in experience, coupled to the existence of a drive for protection, results in the object becoming a source of fear. You're too scared to go to the bar to buy a drink. The ego becomes threatened by itself as an entity. The result of this is that the enlightened self begins to attack itself. It starts to attempt to destroy its own sense of existence, and identity becomes confused. The coherent I, psychological identity, comes under threat of extinction. So finally, in order to defend himself physically, Odysseus tries to... This is an interesting illustration of everything that's just been said. In order to defend himself physically, Odysseus tries to trick the Cyclops by telling the Cyclops that his name is Nobody. When the Cyclops tries to identify Odysseus in order to eat him, he thus suffers confusion, and in this confusion Odysseus takes the opportunity to flee. Odysseus has thus apparently triumphed and saved his physical life. But Adorno argues there is a concealed cost. In order to trick the Cyclops and protect his own life, Odysseus has had to deny his own identity. In terms of psychological survival, therefore, Adorno explains, Odysseus has ironically completed what the Cyclops intended. Odysseus has destroyed his identity, his self. The subject Odysseus denies his own identity, which makes him a subject. Odysseus employed an artifice that breaks the ordinance by fulfilling it, and thereby saves his life by losing himself. So I just end on this point then. When the great classics and deep meaning no longer exist, and as you saw in the previous interview he did in China, basically Christopher Nolan says, yes, we should apologise for greatness. Well, when we're in that situation, I think what Christopher Nolan represents and what his film represents is the way in which, remember the question he was asked by the Chinese interviewer, are you a bard for a civilization at dusk? And yes, I think Christopher Nolan is, but we've only beaten the dark by gathering together like the Cyclops sheep that the Cyclops owns in his cave. We're the sheep of the Cyclops in the dark IMAX cinema, Night of the Soul. Duh, duh, duh. Right, well, this is me and my new plumed helmet. I apologise, that was quite a long talk, but I really wanted to go into the weeds so that when I do in future refer to more of Ian McGilchrist's work, more of Norman Brown, and in particular Philip Reif's work, I thought it would be useful to get this preparatory work out of the way for the hardcore readers of the Lost Art subscribers who really want to see the full mechanics of how the Freudian interpretation works. So until the next time, all the very best. Take care.